Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Boss Economics World, where we peel back the layers of the latest stories in finance, revealing the ever-intriguing world of economic policy, labor markets, and fiscal maneuvering. Now, in today's episode, we're diving deep into Australia's labor market, its central bank's High Wire Act, and the complex, even precarious, position that the Australian economy finds itself in as it wrestles with high inflation, rising unemployment, and the aftershocks of aggressive monetary policy tightening. Now, let's start where the mainstream media headlines leave off. On one hand, employment in Australia in October did rise, but it fell far short of expectations. Forecasters predicted a 25,000 increase in jobs. What we actually saw was shy of 16,000, a much more modest gain. At the same time, the unemployment rate stayed steady at 4.1%, but, crucially, the labour participation rate edged down to 67.1%, signalling that fewer Australians are either working or actively looking for work. Add to this some softening in wage growth, and it's clear, labour market cracks are starting to show. What are we really looking at here? Is this just a little slowdown before the summer heat picks up, or are deeper, more systemic issues coming to haunt the Australian economy? Frankly, folks, there's plenty to be concerned about here, and it's not just the labour market that's the canary in the coal mine. We've got a multitude of factors converging, threatening to push Australia, and indeed many modern developed economies, into a tougher and more protracted economic downturn. So buckle in, we're going to examine the situation slice by slice, from the labour data to central bank policy to wider global trends. Let's start by mapping this out. Australia's economy has generally been resilient over the post-pandemic recovery phase. Job creation has been strong, unemployment had hit multi-decade lows, and wage gains had finally seemed to pick up after years of relative stagnation. But look closer. October's employment growth of just 15,900 was the slowest growth rate in recent months. Isolated, this figure may not raise too many alarm bells, but the slowing job growth comes against a backdrop of rising interest rates that are reaching levels we haven't seen in 13 years. 4.35%, that's where the Reserve Bank of Australia, RBA, has pushed interest rates in its battle against inflation, and unless you've been living under a rock, you know high interest rates typically slow down hiring. Why? Simple, when interest rates rise, credit gets more expensive. Businesses find it harder to borrow or refinance their debt, leading to delays or cuts in hiring and investment. Consumers start pulling back on spending, which means less demand for goods and services. It creates a domino effect that eventually lands on employment numbers. But here's the kicker. While employment rose, it didn't rise nearly enough to justify the level of confidence that had been priced into markets. And that's where the dampening indicators like the participation rate decline start to come into play. A drop in participation means more people are either leaving the workforce or failing to enter it in the first place, which could mask deeper structural flaws in the employment picture. And make no mistake, this is not just an Australian phenomenon. Around the world, advanced economies are bracing for the long-tail impacts of tight monetary policy. Countries from the US to the EU are starting to see similar cracks in their labor markets. So what happens to wages in this kind of environment? Well, here's where the Australian economy hits a bit of a paradox. Earlier this week, we learned that wage growth slowed in Q3 more than expected. Wages grew just 1.3%, and when you factor in inflation, that's very little relief for workers. Inflation remains sticky in the economy, not as bad as what we saw earlier in 2023, but stubborn nonetheless. Governor Michelle Bullock signaled that inflation risks remain high and further rate cuts won't be coming anytime soon. Now, while many of you might say, wait, hold on, isn't slowing wage growth good for inflation? It's not so simple. Certainly, rapid wage growth can fuel inflation when there's more disposable income chasing a limited supply of goods. But what we're seeing in Australia right now is more of a wage price trap. Prices increased sharply due to global supply chain disruptions and energy spikes, but workers never got sufficient wage increases to keep pace. For average Australians, the reality is this: wages are growing slowly, but the cost of living, from housing to groceries to fuel, remains far too high. The upshot? Workers are getting squeezed. This might be why we're seeing the participation rate inch down. If real wage growth is stagnant or negative because of inflation, some workers may simply give up. Some older workers might choose to retire early, finding that staying in the labor force just isn't worth it. Others, younger workers, particularly, might opt out due to discouragement over the types of jobs available. But here's where it gets dicey. For inflation to really come down, the RBA may have to keep interest rates high for longer or raise them even further. This means more pain for employment and wages in the short term, reinforcing the squeeze. This isn't just an Australian problem. As I mentioned earlier, we're seeing similar issues in other developed markets. Let's take the US, for instance. In October, the US reported slower than expected job gains, too. Additionally, US wage growth has been cooling, yet inflation remains higher than target, at nearly 3.7% on an annual basis. Across the Atlantic, the European Central Bank is also walking a fine line. Germany, the economic engine of Europe, just entered a technical recession, driven by high energy prices, weaker exports, and the slowdown in China, a significant trading partner. The Eurozone's inflation fell from nearly 5% to around 2.9% in the latest round, but most of this decline came from energy prices falling. Core inflation, which excludes energy and food, remains sticky. So what's the takeaway here? Well, globally, central banks are all on a similar path, raise rates to kill inflation while somehow keeping their domestic economies on life support. But in reality, we're seeing that inflation, especially core inflation, is proving much harder to shake. High prices for services in particular, think housing, healthcare, or education, are being noticed in every major economy. More importantly, many of these costs are essential, people cannot forego them. So demand remains strong even when interest rates rise. So, where does all this leave Australia? Well, if you read between the lines of what policymakers are saying, particularly RBA Governor Michelle Bullock, you can see there won't be any immediate relief in sight. The RBA has signaled interest rates will likely remain high for now. Bullock herself said she might consider cutting rates sometime in 2025, but that's just speculation at this point. They're forecasting unemployment to rise, possibly reaching 4.5% by late 2025. A higher unemployment rate might relieve some pressure on wage-driven inflation, but it doesn't change the fact that if wage growth doesn't outpace inflation, consumer spending will weaken, economic growth will slow, and the entire economy may slip into a mild recession. But more than anything, the labor market's future will be dictated by the cumulative lag effect of the rate hikes, that is, the delayed economic impact of all these rate increases. Right now, many Australians haven't yet felt the full force of higher interest rates, particularly in the housing market, where 60% of mortgages are fixed rate, many of those set to roll off in 2024-2025. When they do, homeowners will face much higher interest payments, severely denting their budgets. What we have here, friends, is a feedback loop. Wages remain under pressure, employment growth stagnates, inflation stays too high, and monetary policy hits harder. And this is where Australia risks becoming stuck, in a cycle of rising costs, flat wages, and constrained job growth. Now, we can't talk about the economy without touching on the political implications. Australian politicians are well aware of the coming squeeze, and both fiscal and monetary policy will be at the heart of next year's national debates. You can expect labour market reforms, the cost of living crisis, and fiscal assistance to be hot topics going into the next Australian elections. Without intervention, political dissatisfaction will almost inevitably grow. Rising unemployment and stagnating wages could lead to discontent, pushing many Australians towards more radical political fringes, as we've seen with populist movements in Europe and the United States. So what's the final take? Australia's current labour market situation is emblematic of broader, global struggles, economies unsure of how to balance post-pandemic recovery with inflation-fighting policies that are starting to bite. The concern is whether these economic trade-offs will lead to a period of stagflation, when stagnating growth occurs alongside persistent inflation. For now, Australia walks a tightrope, hoping its labour market resilience holds on long enough to ease inflation, but the risks of slipping into a deeper economic funk are very real. That's all for this week's episode of Boss Economics World. See you next time.